success, wealth, recognition. Gary Cooper had it all, lost it all, then turned a revolutionary discovery into the success paradox. Here's Gary.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce Howard Behar to the podcast. Howard is widely respected as a champion of conscious capitalism, an avid practitioner and advocate of the servant leadership philosophy. He is the author of 2 bestsellers, It's Not About the Coffee and The Magic Cup, which chronicle his experiences as the former president of Starbucks North America. Howard, welcome to the Success Paradox.
Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
Howard, you and I have met before this, and we kind of met in a very neat way. My admin assistant, Lisa Litt, came to work with me 4 or 5 years ago now. One day I was in the office, and she said, "You remind me of my old boss, Howard Behar." And I was like, "Who's Howard Behar?" And she bought me the book the next day, It's Not About the Coffee. And I fell in love. And I read the book, and one day sent you a message on LinkedIn, not thinking you would ever reply to me. And I asked you a question, and you said, "Well, why don't you just call me and we'll talk about it?" And I was floored. I could not believe that someone with your accomplishments, and I know you don't like flattery, but you've had a career that spanned over 50 years in consumer-oriented businesses, covering a bunch of different industries. You've retired from Starbucks after 21 years. During your tenure, you participated in the growth of the company from 28 stores to 15,000 stores spanning 5 continents. And you've served on so many boards, it's hard to list them all. Starbucks, Gap, SureGuard, University of Washington Foundation. I mean, I could keep going on and on and on, and you've written 2 books. And you really are the biggest advocate of servant leadership. To have you reach back out to me was really, really amazing. And I guess I'll start with my first question. How do you stay so humble with all those type of accomplishments?
Well, you're talking to a guy that barely got out of high school, and I wouldn't call myself the brightest light in in the room, so to speak. But, I'm a hard worker, and I cared about the things that I do, and mostly I cared about people. And I don't know, it's just who I am. I never really thought about that. I just don't believe in. My mother used to say, "Howard, do your work, keep your head down, do your work, and shut up." That was it.
You've talked a lot about your mom and dad, and you tell a beautiful story about your dad in his grocery store and what he did for a lady when she came in there. My dad too, he came off in the South, we had sharecropping farms, and his mom was a sharecropper. And by the time my dad was 14, his dad died. And so he grew up really tough as well. And he was the first guy off that farm. And I remember growing up in a little retail drugstore, and my dad never turned anybody down whether they could pay or couldn't pay. And that story, if you don't mind sharing, about that story in the grocery store, what your dad did, it reminds me so much of my father. And I think when I read your book, I think I finally found something, and we'll get into this podcast today really is my gift to you. I want you to use this as a platform to talk about servant leadership and kind of how you got into it. I think that story of your father really embodies a lot of what you've been doing for the last 50 or so years, don't you think?
Sure. Well, my father had a small mom and pop grocery store. He was in a neighborhood by the University of Washington, and he opened it before the Depression. And so, he was the neighborhood grocer. In those days, you open in the morning, you close by 6 o'clock. You weren't open on Sundays or nights. And so one day I used to go there every day after school, and, because my mother was working there too, and I was about 9 years old. And one day I was at the store, and I was up by the front of the store where my dad was ringing up a customer in the cash register. Now, these old cash registers, they weren't electric. They were hand cranks, and every time he pulled a crank, it would go bing like that. So my dad was ringing up a customer, And he got done and he said to me, Howard, would you go get me a couple baskets of strawberries out of the back? And so I did. I went back and got the strawberries. My dad put them in the customer's bag, and the customer walked out the door. And I was old enough to understand that my dad hadn't rung those up on the cash register because I didn't hear the bing. And I said to my dad, I said, Dad, you forgot to ring those up on your cash register. And he said, Howard, not everything we do in life do we need to get paid for. These aren't just customers, but more importantly, they're our neighbors and our friends. And right now they're having tough times and they can't afford fresh fruit. And so it's just my way of helping them out. At that time, I really didn't understand. I mean, I was 9 years old, but, I accepted it and thought, gee, that's nice, 9. But as I grew, I remember that story about my dad. And, it was such a valuable lesson because all too often in life, we think that everything we do, we need to get paid for or rewarded for, get a trophy for, or get whatever it is. We need to get something for the things that we do. And, he was the first example of saying that's just not the way you need to live your life. And so I've kind of followed that through the rest of my life. As a matter of fact, that's how I got to Starbucks. I asked Howard Schultz, I said, when he was interviewing me, I said, Howard, can I work in the company for a week for free? I'd like to work on the trucks. I'd like to work in the roasting plant, and I'd like to work in the stores for a few days. And that's how I fell in love with Starbucks. And that's how Howard extended an invitation for me to join Starbucks. So sometimes, you give to get. You serve to be served.
That's such a beautiful story. And what's amazing to me, Howard, is you didn't forget it. And then you put it into practice in your life. And I was doing my homework last night, and something really popped out to me. It's like you had a lot of this natural ability, but you mentioned a man's name, and I'd never heard you mention that name before. And it almost seemed like, Howard was this calm lake, and then this stone dropped into your life that just created ripples, and his name was Jim Jensen.
Right.
How did he affect your life, and how did that ripple across your life the rest of your life?
Well, he was my boss for a number of years, but probably the single most important mentor I've ever had in my life. He truly changed my life. He was the one that introduced me to Robert Greenleaf's work on servant leadership. He introduced me to setting positive affirmations and writing down your goals and identifying who you were as a person and writing down your values and your mission statement. And he was the one that got me to believe that I could do anything that I set my mind to. I had never thought about it before, any of those things. And yet here he was and challenging not only me, but the rest of the leadership team to be all that we could be. And that totally changed the direction of my life. And he's still a friend today. And, it's one of those people that come into your life sometimes that, just really affect you. And he was one of them. Outside of my parents and my family, he was probably the single most important mentor in my life.
How old were you at the time?
I was about 27 years old.
Wow, that was a big change, and it kind of leads me into your servant leadership. What role did you take from Jim? How did you start doing that in the practice of paying it forward to other people?
He was a student of servant leadership as well. And servant leadership at its core is basically defined like this: is that your responsibility of a leader is to help your people grow as human beings, to grow as professionals, and to help them achieve their goals in life. And if you do that well, then the people want to help you. And it's the way that it works. You serve before you get. It has taught me to think completely differently about the world in which I live and how I want to live my life.
Howard, that's a great segue. What I was thinking about is, how did you accomplish getting the instant gratification mindset out, not only at work, but also at home? Because, I got to admit, I've fallen into that instant gratification mindset at work and at home. How did you do that? Let's just take Starbucks, for example, when you started there with 28 stores.
Well, I always believe that I have what I call my 6 Ps. And the first P stands for purpose. Everything I do in my life has to have a purpose greater than myself. And I used to work with my people to get them to understand that we weren't here to serve ourselves, we were here to serve others. It doesn't make any difference what your role in life is, what job you have, whether you're a widget maker, whether you're an architect, whether you're a barista, whether you're a doctor. Everything we do in life is to serve other human beings. And so I just kept focusing on that at Starbucks. And Starbucks' mission went like this, that we want to be one of the most well-known and respected organizations in the world, known for nurturing and inspiring the human spirit. Not a thing about how big we wanted to be, how much coffee we wanted to sell. And so I just kept focusing on the idea of servant leadership. And it wasn't the words I used, it was what I did, how I practiced it. I used to send company birthday and anniversary cards to everybody in the company up until we had about 10,000 people. I thought everybody should be heard in the company. And so I had this term that I used, that the person who sweeps the floor should choose the broom. And what I meant by that is that everybody should be able to vote in their area of expertise. And that meant as a leader, I had to open my ears and open my eyes and listen to the people, because who knew better about what to do than the people that were doing the work? And, and everybody got to vote. Not on everything, of course, but on the things that they knew and understood something about. And so I just kept focusing on that. And so people don't care what you say, they watch what you do. And so I just practiced it and tried to live it. Was I perfect? No. I had my flaws just like every other human being, but I did practice it, and so that drove it with inside the organization. And I brought the concept of servant leadership to Starbucks, and it's still alive today. And it wasn't I didn't create it. It was Robert Greenleaf that created the words for it. Lots of people were servant leaders without knowing really who they were, but they were practicing it anyway. And I was one of those kind of people. I was what I call an unconscious competent. I did it, but I didn't know what I was doing, and I couldn't teach it. And over time, I became a conscious competent. I knew what I was doing, and I could teach it. So that's what we did at Starbucks. The first guiding principle at Starbucks was to treat everybody with respect and dignity. The last guiding principle is we recognize profitability is essential to our future growth and success, not the first. So it's not about making money first, it's about serving people first.
One of the conscious, competent things you did was, it wasn't a play on words, but you changed one of the sayings that is still there today, right?
It goes like this: we're not in the coffee business serving people, but we're in the people business serving coffee. And, when you stay with something over a long period of time, people start to believe it.
I've stolen that and used it in my own company. We're in the infusion business, but I tell people we're in the people business providing infusions. We're not in the infusion business providing it for people. So I follow you on LinkedIn, and I'm really grateful for your post. I may switch the gears a little bit here, and it's tied to what you did at Starbucks as well. It's tied to mental health. You guys were the first people to provide health insurance for part-time workers and workers in the fast food industry. But you talk openly about your own anxiety in life and stuff like that. How did you deal with anxiety? You talk about it openly on LinkedIn in such an important role.
I had terrible anxiety all the time, that I wasn't doing enough. I wasn't doing well enough for the organization. I mean, I in the 21 years I was at Starbucks, I probably never had a night where I slept all the way through. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I had a little pad on my nightstand, and I'd write these notes, and I'd get up in the morning and I couldn't figure out what I'd written down. But it just was part of who I was. I don't know where it came from, but I struggled with it my whole life. And, the truth is that I still can struggle with it. Sometimes I have to work through it. Now, over time, I have learned to work through it. I have learned to remember that this too shall pass. But it was painful at times, that anxiety, and dealing with that anxiety. And lots of people suffer from it and have it. And it at times turned into little depression episodes different times in my life. Particularly when I retired from Starbucks, all of a sudden I went from knowing who I was, or believing that, Starbucks was me and I was Starbucks, which really wasn't the truth. But, I internalized it, and I had 2 years of depression trying to figure out what I was going to do, and who I was at that time. And finally, I realized that my life's work was my life's work. It didn't make any difference where I was doing it. I didn't have to be at Starbucks. I didn't have to do it around a big group of people. I could still just be Howard and serve people, which is what my life's work is all about.
Howard, that's an incredible thing you just shared right there. I think so many people have that, but aren't willing to share it. And that makes it twice as bad. I know I've suffered from anxiety and other issues, and I hid them and disguised them and continued to work through them. And what I would do is I would work on other things. I would work on my work skills. I'd work on physical fitness, but I wouldn't work on my mental fitness. And I'm glad to hear that you figured out how to work through that and how you dealt with that. And I think oftentimes men in particular, and I don't know for my lady friends how they work through it, but I identified with my job rather than who I was. And I think I heard you saying, I thought I was Starbucks or whatever, and I realized my body of work. Thank you so much for sharing that. One of the funny things I heard you say is that you have a board of directors on your shoulders.
True.
Can you explain that? That's hilarious.
Yeah, well, we all do. We just don't recognize it because we all have these internal voices that are talking to us all the time. I have 5 or 6 of them, and they're always yapping on me. I've even named them. They represent voices of my family. And sometimes those voices are, they're trying to convince you to do things. And sometimes the things one of them might be trying to convince you to do isn't really in your best interest and doesn't help you live to your values. And so you have to learn to manage those voices. I think the most difficult person you'll ever have to learn to lead in your life is yourself. And it's
Mm.
because they're always trying to influence you in one way or another. And the goal is to listen to the ones that serve you the best, the ones that not make you more wealthy, not give you more power, but the ones that convince you that serving others is the most important thing that you can do. And so I've learned to listen to those voices. I've learned to manage them because you have to manage them. And most people don't. Most people just respond to those voices, particularly when you're young. You know, as young people, they just, they don't even know they're hearing the voice, but somebody says, "Hey, let's go drink some beer," and their voice just says, "Oh yeah, that'll be fun. Let's go." And they go do it, and they're 15 years old, and they get in trouble. Because they don't stop and say, "What do I really want to do here?"
Those voices are crazy. I call mine the itty bitty shitty committee. Sometimes they can take over, and I have to. I'm
Yeah.
51 now, and I've taken over the itty bitty shitty committee, and I have them more in line like you do. I haven't
Yeah.
named them though.
I think it's the single most important thing you can do in your life is recognize that you do have a board of directors or how you call it, and that you have to learn to manage it. And when you do that, it changes your life.
Besides that, what's a daily practice that you have as you were getting older and getting wiser? What are some daily practices that you put in place for the anxiety and productivity at work? What are some things that you put in place? I know you had the core values, but what are some things you did on a daily basis that kept you even keel?
Well, I have affirmations, and I learned about affirmations from Jim Jensen. And affirmations basically are seeing where you want to be in the present. So it's not a future. So it's things like an affirmation that I use all the time, almost daily, is I am enough, I have enough, I do enough. I am enough, I have enough, I do enough. Another one is that I use is I love myself unconditionally. It's difficult to love yourself unconditionally, and so that's always work that I do. And then I have other affirmations about things that I want that I am in my life that I see myself as. And one is I always treat people with kindness. You know,
When I was able to transform my business and my personal life 6 years ago, I started doing practices like you're describing. So do you have a time of day that you do these things?
I do them when I get up, and I do them when I go to bed.
And that's exactly what I do. I think those are transformative because then the people at work that we're leading see a centered, calm person, and as you just described, responding rather than reacting.
Exactly.
Well, Howard, why don't you go fill up your cup of coffee because we have to stop here. But coming up in the second part of my talk with Howard Behar, the former president of Starbucks and the author of It's Not About the Coffee, Howard talks about why we can all be servant leaders.
A company can change, and an organization can change, and leaders can change, and we can all be servant leaders. So that's, my message, be it. And then servant leadership will become, hopefully how everybody in the world leads.
To learn and practice the Success Paradox lifestyle, visit GaryCCooper.com. The Success Paradox is a production of Forbes Books.